Okay. Hello, everyone. I hope you all had a great Thanksgiving. I'm actually recording this the Friday right before we're about to go on Thanksgiving break, the 20th. So you guys are seeing this quite a bit after I recorded it, but I wanted to be ready to go on that Monday we get back. So we're starting Unit 3. We're midway into the 19th century, and we have to talk about manifest destiny, this sort of all-American concept for good or bad. This is a big part of our history. So, looking at this here. So, manifest destiny is a concept that is quite old, and it's been with us far longer than just the Mexican War. It really was very instrumental in our history prior to that time and after that time. I mean, one has to look back as early as 1607 before Europeans really knew that much about North America. When Jamestown was founded, that's largely a concept of manifest destiny as well, that this continent belongs to white Christian people and they deserve to plant and spread colonies because their system is a better system than the one presently occupied by the peoples of North America. And that concept continued on after the Revolution. I mean, look at right after the Revolution, the United States conquers all the land west of the Appalachians up to the Mississippi. That was a big part of the Revolution was the Royal Proclamation of 1763. We couldn't get our hands on that land. 1803, we buy Louisiana from Napoleon. More and more and more, there was this feeling that the West belonged to America. Now, not everybody agreed with this. This was a very partisan issue. It was the Democrats, the party of Jackson, that wholeheartedly believed in manifest destiny. The Whigs were a bit split on it. Northern Whigs in particular did not want to spread westward. This goes back to Hamilton. Federalists and then later Whigs thought the more that we spread westward, the more our population will move out there, and that will take away population, particularly from the Northeast, from New England, making it less powerful in the House and in the Senate. They also just thought it's a wasteland over to the west. They sort of had this Hamiltonian notion that the future of America would be big coast cities, open to trade, and that whatever was happening in Ohio and Indiana and even further out west was just a sideshow. It was a desert. They thought it was not very interesting, not very important. Consequently, this had an impact on how the Whigs felt about Native Americans. The Whigs were more pro-Native American than the Democrats, right? Look at Worcester v. Georgia and Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. John Marshall, great Federalist judge, thought we should not be taking this land. What are we doing going 2,000 miles to the west? There's plenty of land in the rest of the country. Yet still, there was this nationalistic pride that came into being during this time, and it's coined in 1845 by a journalist by the name of John O'Sullivan, who says, "It is our manifest destiny to spread across the continent." Manifest destiny literally means obvious fate. Manifest means obvious, destiny means fate. So it's our manifest destiny or our obvious fate to spread westward. Why was it so obvious? Well, America was the upcoming nation in the 1830s and 40s. No country was growing like us. And when I say growing, I mean geographically growing, spreading across the continent, population growing, highest birth rate, highest immigration rate, and highest economic growth, all at the same time. It was truly extraordinary. When Europe was being convulsed by revolutions in 1848, every European country pretty much had a revolution in 1848. America was able to absorb millions of immigrants from Germany and Ireland, spread westward, and certainly got into conflicts with the inhabitants of North America, Native Americans. But with our neighbors mostly, and certainly with European nations, we were peaceful, unless somebody came in the way of that manifest destiny, and that will come in the form of the Mexican War. So let's talk about sort of the origins of this conflict. Now, this is a map of Mexico post-independence. Mexico gains its independence in 1823. One. They had declared independence in 1810. Remember, Napoleon crosses the Pyrenees, invades Spain in 1808, and that sent convulsions all over Latin America. Many of the peoples who lived there, the leaders of those governments, sort of said, oh, the mother country cannot reinforce us now. We're sort of cut off, so we can just sort of declare independence like those Americans, like the gringos did in 1776. Mexico, following the lead of a lot of these other countries, declared independence, still had to fight for it, but won. And in 1821, they declared independence. And America rejoiced at this. We were happy for two reasons. Number one, Mexico could now buy American products. Remember that under mercantilist ideology, Spain controlled Mexico, and Mexico had to buy Spanish goods. Now, Mexico was an independent country and could buy from whomever they wanted, and that meant they would buy American grain, American finished products, furniture, cotton, everything. So we would now have a wonderful trade partner. But there was also this ideological reason. Notice it's 1821, the Monroe Doctrine is just coming up, and how America viewed itself. America viewed itself as a democratic republic, as opposed to those monarchies in Europe. We were going to provide sort of a umbrella of protection to every country in the Western Hemisphere to keep them independent. And honestly, we were very flattered. Mexico was following in our footsteps. Mexico had a revolution, and they did not hide what they were doing. They said, we are copying the example of los Yankees, the Americanos, right? And Yankees in Spanish is spelled with a Q, you know, Yanquis. It didn't always have a negative connotation. Today it kind of does. Usually when you see that term, you know, in Spanish, it usually refers to like American colonization, this big bully to the north that's, you know, invading us all the time. But in the 1820s, Mexico wrote a constitution and they largely copied ours. They, unlike European countries, they had a federal system. They have a central government and they have estados, they have states. They have a federal district, just like the US does. We have DC, they have DF, or Mexico City. They do not have a parliament, they have a Congreso. They have a presidente, just like we do. They don't have a prime minister. They largely copied our constitution in a flattering way, and we were very flattered by this. And so the US, this is sort of a missed opportunity, but in the beginning here, it looked like there might be a wonderful relationship between the US and Mexico. Now, at the very same time that a war is brewing between us and Mexico in 1845-46, tensions are mounting also over Oregon, which is up here off the map. If you recall, John Quincy Adams had negotiated a treaty with the British there. We bullied the Russians to get them out, and they pulled back to Alaska. And we created what's known as a condominium, a sort of joint ownership between us and the British over Oregon. Now, this is starting in the 1820s. For 20 years or so, we could go along with this system, but by 1845, it seemed untenable. So many people had moved into Oregon. They needed a legal structure. They needed representation. And how would you do that answering to two separate countries? And of course, being closer to the action, and because of Manifest Destiny, the US basically felt it should all belong to us. Now understand, when I say Oregon, I don't mean the state of Oregon. I mean Oregon territory. It encompassed what's today Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and all of British Columbia. So 1844, we have an election. The Whigs nominate, I think for the fourth time, Henry Clay. Poor Henry Clay. He ran more times for president and lost more times than anybody else. And as I said before, he's probably the greatest politician America created, maybe other than Abraham Lincoln. And he's just so unappreciated. Nobody even remembers him today. And he probably should have been president because most of the men he ran against were pretty inferior politicians to him. James K. Polk, a no-name person out of the Democratic Party, after Jackson dies and Martin Van Buren runs for president, and then the Whigs win the 1840 election. Notice how unlucky Clay is. The one time he doesn't run for president in 1840, the Whigs win, and that president dies very shortly into that presidency. This was Polk's closest he ever came. He nearly won this election, but he does lose. Polk was the most pro-Manifest Destiny president we ever had. He runs in 1844 essentially saying, I want two wars at the same time. We're going to fight Mexico for all of the area in the Southwest, and we're going to fight Britain to gain all of Oregon. And his slogan was 54-40 or fight. That was his slogan, basically saying, elect me, I want all of Oregon. If I don't get it, we're going to war with the British. Now, he, of course, backed off of that. Essentially, what he did was negotiated a treaty by which we just divided Oregon in half at 49 degrees latitude. So he did not follow through on that campaign pledge. He didn't want a war with the British Empire. We negotiated just to extend the border that was between Minnesota and Canada in the Midwest and just go due west 1,000 miles and just chop that territory in two. He then turned his attention towards Mexico and got us involved there. Now, we have to rewind a decade or two to explain why were we even fighting Mexico. Yes, Manifest Destiny is important, but there's a lot of other events going on too. So this is Mexico upon independence. It was actually larger than the United States in terms of territory, not in terms of population. That's even with the Louisiana Territory and everything east of it. But it was very thinly populated in the north, in El Norte. Okay, this is the Mexican state of California, and this is the Mexican state of Tejas. Now, California, notice, is enormous and hardly anybody lived there. The population of California, and when I say California, I mean California, Arizona, Utah, Nevada, this vast region here, only about 70,000 Mexican nationals live there. There were probably 150,000 Native Americans living there, but they weren't Mexican citizens. So very thinly populated. California's perennial problem is water, as you guys, I'm sure, very well know. I almost have to do a lesson on rivers and why they exist and where they come from, because we get so little rain here, and we don't have rivers. We have concrete channels that we artificially created to take this water to the ocean. California is a desert, and it could not sustain large population, although it's a paradise. The weather here is wonderful. Everyone wants to live here. What America started to do largely in the 20th century was build aqueducts and take water from various regions in the West, and people flocked here, and it's sort of this vicious cycle where more people move in, and then we need more water, and we have to take more, and we're kind of at a point now where the state is full, and we got 40 million people and not enough water, and it continues. But at the time, in the 1820s, hardly anybody at all lived in California. More people lived in New Mexico, quite a bit more, this state here, because there's actually a river valley that runs right through the middle. And so you have the Colorado River, and you have little, villages on either side. California had far less rainfall even than New Mexico. This is the state of Tejas, also very far to the north, and also very dangerous because the Native American tribe, the Comanche, lived there. They were nomadic, they were warriors, and they were the most feared cavalry soldiers in the world in the early 19th century. Worse than the Russian Cossacks, worse than the US cavalry, worse than anybody else. They were just feared because they were so good. They had introduced the horse and the repeating rifle into their form of combat, and everybody was terrified of the Comanche. And they would leave Tejas on occasion and go into these other Mexican states and launch raids. And so Mexico decided upon independence that they would create an immigration system to help them deal with this problem. They basically said, if the gringos are good at anything, it's fighting the Native Americans. They've done that numerous times in the past and been successful. So let's invite white American settlers into Tejas and offer them citizenship. And of course, people flooded in. Mostly these are white Southerners who come in. They're white men from Texas, we're talking about Texas or Tejas, from Louisiana, from Alabama, from Arkansas, from Tennessee, largely. And they flood into eastern Texas. Now, Texas is so big, it's like 3 states in one in terms of their climate and geography. California is largely the same way. The eastern part of Texas, this part that we're talking about on the Gulf Coast, very marshy, swampy, wet, green. We're talking about Galveston, Beaumont, Houston, wet, lots of rainfall, perfect for growing cotton. Then when you get into the western parts, it's very desertous. This area over here of Texas, like El Paso, Amarillo, it looks like Arizona or, you know, Bakersfield or any place like that that's out in the desert. Then you have the part way up in the Panhandle and the northern part that's like the Great Plains. It looks like Kansas up there, and there's a lot of corn and grain and stuff. We're talking about eastern Texas. This is where white immigrants from the US moved to, and they were very happy. Now, the Mexican government had a very tense relationship with these immigrants, which often happens with immigrant groups. Problem number one was that a lot of these people who moved in brought their slaves with them. They were looking for cheap land. They wanted to bring slaves into Texas, and land was very cheap there, as long as you promised to live in these areas around forts and defend against Comanche attacks, sort of creating a buffer zone for the Mexican states south of Tejas. If you agreed to do that, you weren't supposed to bring your slaves in with you, but they did anyway. They realized that they were so far removed from the central authority. The capital of Mexico is Mexico City down here in the south, where most people live. Mexico City is far bigger than any city in the US. It's over twice as big as New York. New York has about 8 million people. Mexico City, last time I checked, is close to about 20 million people. So something like 1 out of every 5 or 6 Mexican people lives in Mexico City. Then if you go due west, you have Guadalajara, which is 7 or 8 million people. You got Veracruz in the east. You've got all these other states, Michoacan, Querétaro, very densely populated. Once you get up here to Sonora, here, Chihuahua, very desertous, thinly populated, hardly anybody lives there, and especially when you get up here into California. So California to Mexico would be like Alaska to us. Huge geographic area, but only 700,000 Americans live there. And if I was told tomorrow that we had sold it to somebody, I'd go, all right, well, that's a bummer, but I was never going to go there anyway, probably. Aw, shucks, you know. That's kind of how Mexico viewed it. Hardly anybody people live there. It was remote. It was hard to control. Likewise with Tejas as well. Second problem is that the Mexican government wanted immigrants who live there to grow corn to sell to poor Mexican citizens living in the heart of Mexico. Americans don't like being told what to produce and whom to sell to and what the price will be. Essentially, the Mexican government would be setting the price of corn, buying it, and they could only sell it to the Mexican government for distribution for the poor. White farmers in America hated that, where we had a tradition where you just kind of do what you want. And finally, there was huge culture clash over language and over religion. Mexico didn't have freedom of religion like the US did. Now, the US legally, constitutionally, had freedom of religion, but the population of the US would discriminate against Catholics that moved in. Catholics were less tolerant of Protestants wherever they had control. So Mexico said our official religion is Catholicism. Protestants can live here and you know, and essentially practice in private, but you know, we want you to go to church. If you're immigrating to Mexico, you have to convert to Catholicism. It was a theocratic state basically in the early 19th century. And so of course you might imagine Protestants moving there are told you have to convert to Catholicism. Now some did, but many said, all right, I'll go through the process, but I'm still going to practice Protestantism in private. Second, you got to learn Spanish. This was very, very hard for the gringos, and I sympathize. My son is in a dual immersion program. I try to, you know, help him out with stuff, and it's very, very hard for me to learn. It's incredibly hard for me to learn. I remember my first lesson, and they said, all right, first, before we teach you the verb to be, there's 2 verbs to be. There's ser and estar, and you got to ask yourself 8 questions before you figure out which one you're going to use. Is it action and immediate progress? Is it location? Is it, and I'm just like, oh my God, already my brain hurts. There's 2 is's, and you gender the nouns? Like, why you gotta do that? There's 4 ways to say the? It's crazy. Not gonna do it, right? I'm joking, of course. Spanish is actually technically an easier language than English. English grammatical rules make no sense, and there's 18,000 exceptions. There's about 1 million contractions. You guys know there's only 2 contractions in the whole Spanish language? Al and del, that is it. In English, there's thousands of contractions, and it always confuses people. Yet still, it's hard to learn another language when, you know, you're isolated from the population and you can just talk to your family in English. If you guys don't know, there's actually quite a few Spanish words that have found their way into like Texas slang, but it doesn't sound anything like the Spanish that it came from. For instance, if you ever go to Texas, you will hear white folks with cowboy hats um, say things like, you know, you got a grandpa and it's Thanksgiving and he's talking to his grandson. He says, "Hey, buckaroo, you want to go play out in the backyard?" What is a buckaroo? Do you guys have any idea? It's a vaquero. It's a cowboy, right? Sounds exactly the same. Vaquero, buckaroo, sounds exactly the same, right? Um, or you might hear a white Texas guy with a 10-gallon hat. He might say, "All right, it's getting a little late. We better vamoose, everybody." What on earth is vamoose? Some of you probably figured out already. It's vamos, right? Let's go. Sounds exactly the same, right? Vamoose. So, and this goes on and on and on. There's a lot of these words. God bless them. They tried, but kind of like the Texans that were on my trip to France 12 years ago, they tried and they failed. I still remember them practicing on the bus when we landed at Charles de Gaulle Airport and we were driving in, and they say, "Oh, how do you say hello?" "I think it's bonjour." No, it's bonjour, but they, you know, they try, they fail. And this created a lot of tension because Mexican nationals living in Tejas had this attitude: geez, these Americans moved in, they don't speak our language, they don't follow our customs, our religion, we don't like them. And likewise, the white Texans that moved there didn't like getting harassed by the government, wanted to bring their slaves with them. And frankly, we're getting shaken down by a lot of the corrupt officials that live there. Like, all right, you can keep your slaves, but like, give me some money. And they just felt like, we don't like this. We don't like this at all. So there was a toxic relationship between white Texans that live there and Tejanos who felt like these were outsiders, you know, coming in and ruining everything. By 1836, after about 10 years of immigration, white Texans outnumbered Tejanos, that's Mexican Texans, by 10-1. Effectively, Texans through immigration had taken over the state. And it was still part of Mexico, but it was a very tenuous relationship, which was about to explode in 1836. Now comes the Texas Revolt. Now, if we were from Texas right now, we would spend about a month on this project. We'd have a field trip to the Alamo, to San Antonio. We would talk about this forever. I would cry big tears because it's like the greatest event in history to Texans. If you guys are unaware of this, people from Texas have a superiority complex like you would not believe. And it's very jarring and bizarre when an outsider goes to Texas and you hear this kind of talk. It's like they're their own country almost, that they're better than the rest of America, that they're sort of Americans twice over. They're sort of refried, double dip Americans. And it's not just because they're rather large in the waistband, if you know what I mean. Texans eat a lot of fried food. It's really because of the Texas Revolt. In their eyes, they have had two revolutions, the Revolution of 1776 and the Revolution of 1836, and they won both, and therefore they're twice as good as the rest of Americans. A lot of people don't know outside of Texas, Texas was the only state to become a state that was its own country for a while. I guess technically that's not true. Technically, California was its own country, but it was only for about 2 weeks before we were annexed by the US government. Texas was its own country for 10 years. So here's the story behind that. So it's 1836. White Texans outnumber Tejanos 10-1. There's tense relations there. And a new president is elected during this time period. His name was Antonio Lopez de Santana, a very mythical figure in Mexican history. He's known as the Mexican Napoleon, a very competent general. He had been president numerous times, or would be Mexican president numerous times, but he had no respect for law, order, democracy, or anything like that. He was a general. Notice how important leadership and personalities are. I think I mentioned this before. Whatever problems we may have about George Washington, one very good thing we can say about him is he did not want to take over America. He could have very easily, and he decided, I want more than power for myself. I want my country to be free and have elections and trade power. It's very tempting when you're an authority to throw out the rule book and just stay in power forever. And so Santana was very frustrated with how slow democracy worked. And he just one day decided he would order the Congress to be closed, the Mexican Congress, and that he would just abolish the Constitution just by fiat. Fiat is Latin for let it be, just like I have no legal authority to do this, but I'm the president and I control the army. And Congress, you're closed. He ordered the army to close Congress. And then he said, I'm ripping up the Constitution of 1824 and I'm writing a new one. Now, this would just not fly in America, but in Mexico, they were only a country for about 15 years. Santa Anna had tremendous respect because he was a revolutionary founding father, much like George Washington. And he had spent his life in the army, and the army respected him and did everything he said. So he effectively launched a coup here, which many Mexican people did not like. Now, here's something in favor of the Texans, because when you hear about this from the Mexican perspective, often you hear that these were sort of white immigrants who wanted a revolution and they just took advantage of this situation and seceded from Mexico. That's partially true. But also one can't forget that Santa Anna was a tyrant, and there was more than just Texas that revolted against him. All of these Mexican states here, all of them, not all 37, but these ones here rose up in revolt against Santa Anna, saying that he had performed an unconstitutional coup and he couldn't do that. Santa Anna then got on his horse and marched the army into every one of these states and brutally crushed the revolt, with one exception, and that was Tejas. The problem with the gringos is they do know how to fight. They were invited in to man forts. They all had military training and had to serve in the militia there. And so they were ready and waiting for Santa Anna. Now, we don't have time to get into the story. This isn't, a Texas history class, but if you ever wonder why the Alamo is so important, that's where a lot of the Texas volunteers made their last stand. The Alamo is this fortress outside San Antonio. Where is the Alamo on my map? Right here. And they made a stand there so that the rest of the Texas militia could retreat to the east. Santa Anna swarmed and surrounded the Alamo. He gave them a couple of days to surrender, which they refused. And Santa Anna ordered an all-out assault on the Alamo, and he took no prisoners, held no quarter. That means that you just kill every last survivor. That's how Davy Crockett very infamously died there at the Alamo. He was just hacked to death after he had surrendered, and it was just hopeless at that point. Sam Houston and Steve Austin and all the other founding fathers of Texas fled to the east, where Santa Anna caught up with them a little bit later, a couple months later, where they ambushed and surrounded Santa Anna and actually captured him. Now, this is quite astounding because he's not only the lead general in this invading army, but he's also the president of Mexico, which they captured. So they quite literally stick a gun in his face and make him sign a treaty, the Treaty of San Jacinto, which says that Texas is an independent republic and that Mexico relinquishes all control. They then release Santa Anna to go back. The Congress, the Mexican Congress, stripped Santa Anna of his presidency. They were so angry that he surrendered. They said, you should have taken death rather than the dishonor of doing that. And we enter a very bizarre period after this, where Mexico claims we still control Texas, that treaty is not binding. It was a sham treaty. And the people of Texas saying, nope, we're an independent republic. We're free. We got the treaty. We had a revolution. Deal with it. So for 10 years, there's this sort of standoff between the two. Mexico tried repeatedly to invade, but Texas was heavily fortified. They borrowed a bunch of money and they had a lot of soldiers and they were able to protect their independence. But every single day of their independence, they pled for annexation to the United States for a couple of reasons. Number one, remember, almost everybody who lived in Texas, 90%, were transplanted Americans. Most of them had only lived in Texas for about 4 or 5 years before it became its own independent country. So they just said, well, I was born in America. I lived 90% of my life there. I lived in Mexico for 5 years. Now we're our own independent country. Why don't we just become a United State and we'll be annexed? Second, Texas had incurred a rather sizable debt, providing for its own independence and its own army. They borrowed mostly from British banks in a huge capacity, and they were darn near broke at this point. And they knew that if that they knew they were Americans. They knew what manifest destiny meant. They knew America wanted annexation. And they knew that as a condition, they could say, hey, you can annex us, but we want you to absorb all of our debt and all the rest of the country will have to pay it off, right? Like rich Yankees in Connecticut will have to pay off part of Texas's debt, which was very tempting for them. And finally, they felt it would be a lot better if the US could protect us and protect our further independence, meaning if we were part of the United States, that meant that every single part of the country would send soldiers to defend our borders, and we'd have fortresses manned by people from all over the country rather than providing it ourselves. So for those three reasons, they begged for 10 years for annexation. Amazingly, despite manifest destiny, numerous US presidents pass on the idea. This is when Andrew Jackson is president. Andrew Jackson was always itching for a fight. Why didn't he annex Texas? I'll tell you in a minute. Then after that, you had Martin Van Buren for 4 years. He said, I don't want to annex Texas. I don't want to go anywhere near this issue. Then you had William Henry Harrison. He was only president 30 days, but for those 30 days, he said, nope, I don't want to annex Texas. And then finally, you have John Tyler, who for 4 years likewise said, I don't want to annex Texas. Can you think of why? Just wondering, you can pause it here for a minute and think, why wouldn't the US, if they're inclined to want to spread westward, and you would think they would want to? Well, this is for two reasons primarily. Number one, Mexico made it very plain. They were aware that Texas was, flirting with annexation, asking the US, please annex us. And so Mexico told the United States, if you annex Texas, that's an act of war. You are effectively invading and stealing one of our states, and we will go to war with you. Mexico had just fought a war. The US had not fought one for a very long time, since 1812, and didn't do very well in that war. And even though we were a larger country, we weren't fully mobilized, and Mexico had a much larger, better trained army. We would have to have either a draft or beef up the army with a sort of induced volunteerism. It would cost a fortune. Maybe we would lose it. And so partially for that reason, all these presidents said no. The bigger issue is that this would once again raise this difficult question: would Texas be a slave or a free state? Would they have a say over it? Would John Calhoun throw a huge fit again and South Carolina secede if we tried to phase out slavery there? Is there another state we can balance out Texas with that's a free state so that the South doesn't have the majority in the Senate? No, there wasn't. There weren't any states yet ready for admission that were free. So this created the political problem of North v. South. And everybody saw this is another Missouri Compromise situation, and we might have a civil war over this issue. Very prescient. That's technically what the Civil War was all about, was not really Texas, but these other Western territories we get from Mexico, and we can't decide what to do with them, slave or free. So for those two reasons, the US decided in its leadership, let's not annex Texas. Finally, in 1845, they decided, we've waited long enough, we have to do this. Texas got very clever. What they did is they made very public and open negotiations with the British and said, gosh, we're in so much debt. Britain, how would you like to have naval bases right here on our coastline? And then you can cancel the debt we have in lieu of payments, basically. Instead of you paying us every year for these military bases, you just wipe the debt clean. And Britain was very interested in that. And you better believe that this scared the hell out of American politicians, that the British would have multiple naval bases just about 200 miles from New Orleans. So if ever there was a war again between us and Britain, we have this 3,000-mile border in the north with Canada, but we also have naval bases, and the British Navy was something to be feared. They might take New Orleans in the first day of fighting, and then it would be all over. We would lose. So the US sprung into action and said, no, 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 Britain can't be here. The Monroe Doctrine, after all. No, European powers in our hemisphere. We will annex you, Texas. Now, what happened, kind of interesting, John Tyler tried to get it passed as a treaty, but a treaty you need 2/3 vote in the Senate, and it failed. Northern Whigs were so opposed to it, they saw that this was a scheme to acquire a new territory so that slavery could spread there, and they said, we refuse. When Tyler couldn't get a treaty done, he said, all right, let's just do an act of Congress. All I need is 51%. Now, most people felt this was illegal and unconstitutional, but he did it anyway. He just lowered the threshold and said, well, we're not doing a treaty. We're just going to do something else. So Texas went from a republic. It was known as the Lone Star Republic. It was called Lone Star because it just had one star on its flag. It's just one state. And then it became another state in the United States. And they have forever been very, very proud. And to us, it seems kind of bizarre. Like, how could you even compare the Texas Revolt to the American Revolution of 1776? When Texans think about Steve Austin and Sam Houston and Sam Bowie and Davy Crockett, they often think those guys were better than Jefferson and Washington and Adams, which I think is crazy, but that's what they think. And that's why they're so in love with their history and so in love with themselves. If you guys ever do go to Texas, they have a state song. Do you guys even know what California's state song is? I don't even know. Texas has it. It's called Deep in the Heart of Texas. And you can sort of test out Texans because they all know it and they sing it all the time. And it goes, the stars at night, they shine so bright. All you got to do is say that anywhere in public in Texas, and everyone will burst out going, deep in the heart of Texas. It's hilarious. They just love their state so much. Kids in Texas schools literally stand up, they say the Pledge of Allegiance to the US flag, and then they turn and they say the Texas Pledge to the Texas flag. Most of us couldn't find a California flag. If you gave us a scavenger hunt of 2 weeks, we couldn't probably find one. And even if you did, do you guys know the Pledge of Allegiance to California? Do we even have one? I don't know. That's the cultural difference about Texas. And I just wanted to explain that so that you guys get it. So if you ever do go there, you're like, whoa, you guys are really in your face about being from Texas. That's why. They have their own revolution there that they're very proud of. So the US annexes Texas in 1845. And Mexico cuts off diplomatic relations. They send our ambassador back home. They don't talk to us. They don't trade with us. But they don't declare war, which is rather interesting, which goes to show Mexico might have done a deal over Texas. We might have been able to negotiate and not have a war. The problem is Polk wanted a war because he said, I'm not satisfied with Texas. I want all of the Southwest as well. He just negotiated this treaty where he got Oregon, the southern part anyway, 49 degrees latitude and south of that, turned over to the US. And he said, I want this territory too. And maybe I can get it by negotiation, but it's doubtful. So Polk sends John Slidell to Mexico to negotiate and said, I'm very sorry with what happened, but you know what? You guys did not want British naval bases close to your coastline any more than we did. If you guys were going to reacquire Texas, you would have done it in 10 years. We didn't do it immediately. We waited. You're just going to have to accept this. We're going to smooth things over. Okay, so Slidell offers $30 million in exchange for Texas. And so Mexico would have to agree that Texas is ours and sign on the dotted line and agree to it. And there would be no war. Yet at the end, Slidell says, oh yeah, and I forgot one thing. We want you to throw in California and New Mexico for free. All three of them for $30 million, which was a very low price. Remember, we had paid $15 million for Louisiana, but the French were desperate. They had no interest in it. And that was 1803 dollars. This was $30 million for an area that is enormous and that I'm kind of fond of because I live, here in Southern California, and it's a beautiful area. It's great, wonderful farmland, vacation area, climate, everything. And so Mexico did not want to part with it, partially for pride, but partially for economic reasons and security reasons. And so they said, no, this is a huge insult. So they send Slidell home, and it seems like war might be inevitable. The final reason we had a war with Mexico, besides annexation and besides the really poor negotiations of Slidell, history has shown that Slidell was not a poor negotiator. He wanted a war. Hopefully that makes sense to you, that this was not like, oh, I'm dumb and I don't know how to negotiate to get peace. They didn't want peace. They wanted war because they thought they could win. And they thought, if we insult Mexico and ask for California and New Mexico, it's great if they sell it to us. If they don't, we'll have a war and take it for free. Slidell is sent back home, might not have had a war, but part of the problem was we had this huge disputed zone between our two countries. Now, what was Texas? Texans said, well, when we lived here under Mexican rule, this large area here encompassed Texas, this huge, vast region. Mexicans, on the other hand, said, no. The Nueces River that runs here is the border of Texas, not the Rio Grande. We claim this area in between. So both sides are claiming this sort of checkered area here. Can't have that in diplomatic relations. It's going to cause a problem, which of course Polk exploited. James K. Polk said, all right, well, let's just test this out. He ordered General Zachary Taylor to cross the Nueces into the disputed zone, right up to the Rio Grande. And in fact, they marched all the way south here to the Rio Grande River and started shelling the town of Matamoros on the other side of the river for no reason whatsoever, just to annoy the Mexican government. Mexico responded, and you might imagine what they thought when this happened. As soon as those gringo troops crossed the Nueces, Mexico felt, we've been invaded. They have invaded our country. We have to defend ourselves. So they respond by sending their forces into the disputed zone. And there's a little skirmish. Not that many people are killed, a couple of dozen on both sides. There's been no declaration of war, but this created the bloodshed that would then lead to war. Polk takes this message to Congress and says, Mexico has violated our sovereign territory and they have shed American blood on American soil. What are we going to do? Congress declares war and we're at war. Now, today, and even at the time, the Whig Party, Northern Whigs, there was a young Whig congressman from Illinois by the name of Abraham Lincoln, who just got elected in 1844. And he argued that Mexico could equally argue that they were invaded and that Mexican blood was shed on Mexican soil. Nonetheless, though, it means war. So, the war is very quick. We're not going to really talk about, if you notice the War of 1812, the Revolution, most of these wars we talk about, we don't spend a lot of time on military strategy and battles because they're not all that important for the AP test. Very interesting. I encourage you to take a military history class to learn, the ins and outs of war. But for this class, it's not so important. What's important is sort of why we go to war and then what are the consequences of that war? How did the war reshape American society? First of all, the war is pretty quick. It's about 18 months. And the benefits are enormous. The United States gained a huge amount of territory from it, and Mexico lost a huge amount of territory. Polk dropped that 5440 stipulation with the British, negotiated with them to 49 degrees latitude, and then turned on Mexico and invades. It was a three-prong invasion. One prong was to invade from Texas into northeastern Mexico. Another prong was to march all the way west to California. And another one was to land in Veracruz, march through the mountains, and take Mexico City on three sides, which we did. American troops here occupied Mexico City in the summer of 1847 and stayed for about 8 months. Game over. When your troops occupy the opposing side's capital and you capture their politicians and everything, that's it. You run the ball game. And so they would not talk to John Slidell, so Polk had to send another diplomat, Nicholas Trist, who went and negotiated and effectively negotiated this treaty, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So what's in this treaty? Well, number one, the Texas issue was settled in favor of the United States. Mexico agreed to Texas annexation. They had to, right? We won the war. Number two, they agreed to throw in New Mexico and California. They didn't have much other choice about it. And we had a further insult to this by saying, well, we offered you $30 million 2 years ago. You turned that down. So we're only going to offer you $15 million now because the war was so expensive and the US lost so many troops. One interesting little nugget about this is the Mexican War, although relatively low in casualties, I forget the exact amount, but it's somewhere between like 10 and 15,000 soldiers died. Pretty small compared to World War II, which is 300,000, World War I, which is about 175,000, the Civil War, which was about 700,000. It had the highest casualty rate in terms of the number of men that fought and the number of men that died was a higher percent than any war we ever fought before or since. The main reason for that was disease. Back in the day, actually, it wasn't bullets necessarily that killed you in war. You took all these farm boys and then you congregated them together and disease would just spread so rapidly through the rank. Cholera, influenza, all this stuff. And tens of thousands of Americans died from disease. And so, sort of as a punishment to Mexico, we said, you're going to pay for that, for the loss of American lives and for the fact that you made us fight for it. And that costs a lot of money. We're not giving you 30 million. We're going to give you 15 million. And finally, one of these issues that stayed with us forever since is the fate of what will be called the Chicano people. Chicano pretty much means Mexican American. It means that you are of Mexican descent, but you live within the United States. Notice these people are not immigrants. The US conquered territory that they lived in. Very famously, Mexican people have said, we didn't cross the border crossed us, right? Like often Mexican people are insulted in the US by people saying, well, you guys illegally crossed the border, etc. And many Mexican people are very defensive about that, understandably, and they respond that you stole our country, we didn't sneak in here, right? There's a grain of truth in that. It is true that the US conquered this, and there was always a population of Chicanos in Texas, New Mexico, and California. The numbers were rather small, though. 70,000 living in, and I think I misspoke earlier, I said 70,000 in California. It was actually 70,000 in New Mexico, 20,000 in California. 90,000 people out of a rather enormous country. It was less than 1% of the Mexican population. The vast majority of Chicanos that live in the US today immigrated much, much later, really just in the last 40 years. It may shock you to know that when my parents moved to California, my mother in the 50s, my father in the 60s, they told me you couldn't find a Mexican restaurant anywhere during those years. Spanish was not spoken very much in California. Yeah, the names and the culture and the missions and stuff like that, but the population was very white before the 1970s, pretty much. There was always a population here, but they were a minority, essentially, because there was so much white migration from the rest of the US. In any case, Mexico was very concerned about these people and said, all right, well, and by the way, they were some of the richest people in all of Mexico. The people in New Mexico owned huge rancheros, haciendas, beautiful, ranches where they raised cattle and beef, and in California likewise. And so they were very worried about citizenship. They wanted to know, will these people be able to maintain their citizenship? And will they be able to maintain their property? And we promised them yes, and then we immediately said no. Notice the American attitude. If you are white, the law is sacred. If you're white, you can vote even if you can't read. You can vote even if you don't own land. If you are Black, if you are Hispanic, if you're Native American, if you're Mexican, you're sort of presumed to be the other, and we can just sort of play these games and toy with your citizenship. The state of Texas and the territories of New Mexico and California do everything they can to tear up these old deeds, right? Because basically this treaty said, if you can prove with documentation that you own the land and that you are a Mexican citizen, automatically the US will grant that. But through corruption and harassment, we never honored that. A lot of this land is just taken over. A lot of these Mexican landowners are bullied and threatened by just sort of gangs, posses that work for these white beef companies, basically white-owned beef companies, I should say. And they're often relegated to working on the ranch as a ranch hand after they had owned it for probably 200 years. So it's a very difficult situation and not a very nice thing that was done, but it certainly was done. And as you guys probably know, the US and Mexico have decent relations. It's pretty good. We have not had a war with them since 1848. For 170 years, we've been at peace with Mexico. But notice it's a tenser relationship than ours with Canada. The US and Canada, and forgive me, this might be offensive to Canadians, it's almost the same country, right? Like, not Quebec, but the rest of the country. The accent's very similar. It's a predominantly white country. They former British colony. The standard of living's basically the same, and it's hard to tell, well, is that celebrity from Canada or the United States? I don't know. Drake, Ryan Gosling, are they Canadian? Are they American? When do they become American if they live here long enough? There's a much bigger difference when you go south of the border. It's a different ethnicity, it's a different language, it's a different religion. And because there's a big wealth disparity, there's much more immigration from Mexico, and it causes this tension, as you might imagine. So this is the history of that tension, why it is that way. Okay, moving on to the next slide. If you don't recognize this gentleman here, this is the one-term congressman I was just talking about a little while ago. That's Abraham Lincoln. He got elected as a Whig. He was an anti-war Whig. And because he voted against the war, he was voted out of office in 1846. So prior to him becoming president, Lincoln was our least experienced president ever. He never was a governor. He never was a senator. He was a one-time congressman from Illinois and became our greatest president ever, which is pretty astonishing. Here's the consequences. The US expands by 70%. James K. Polk, this is a fascinating statistic. He is the president that presided over more territorial acquisition to the US than any other president in American history. Andrew Johnson will be president when we acquire Alaska, but Texas, Oregon, California, New Mexico were bigger than Alaska, bigger than Louisiana territory that Jefferson got, bigger than what Washington gained upon independence, the territories in the West. So Polk, this sort of no-name president, actually got more land than anybody else. And although looking back at it, one might say this was a very aggressive war. America didn't need to fight. But I'll say two things about it. Number one, I live here, so I'd be a hypocrite if I said we should give it back. Because, I'll ask you, you guys want to move to Iowa, which is about as far west as you can go in the U.S. without getting to the Western territories we took from Mexico? I don't want to move to Iowa. Probably you don't either. And second, the U.S. did a lot of good with this territory that we had. If one fast forwards and looks at the Second World War, the U.S. fought Japan pretty much single-handedly without any allies, and we did that because we had ports on the Pacific by which we could project our power and fight and, in fact, liberate all of Asia. So, sometimes good can come from bad, I guess you might say. Now, the other major consequence of this is tension over slavery, that the Mexican War unleashed sectionalism between North and South, the likes of which we had never seen before. Now, David Wilmot, who was a congressman from Pennsylvania and a Democrat, in fact, before the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was even signed, he said, you know what, we're going to win this war and we're probably going to get a lot of territory. Why don't we pass a law that says any territory we take from Mexico will be free and forever free? After all, Mexico had banned slavery in their 1824 Constitution. It did not exist. There was not a single slave anywhere in any of these territories. Texas there was, but in the rest of it there would not be. And so Wilmot just said, why don't we just keep slavery out of those areas? What's interesting is not the Wilmot Proviso as a law, because it never passed. What's interesting is the vote breakdown. Now, you would expect any vote breakdown to be partisan, right? Like the Whigs vote this way and the Democrats vote another way. That's not how it broke down. It broke down sectionally, meaning Northern Democrats and Northern Whigs said, aha, I like this. Let's vote to ban slavery there. Southern Whigs and Southern Democrats voted together saying, no, we have to allow slavery there. That was a sign that the future would be very troublesome. If you can stop talking about slavery and start talking about the national bank and internal improvements and the tariff and things like that, then you get a nice national partisan system where each state is, 50-50 or 60-40, like it is in America today. If you talk about slavery, everyone in the South is pro-slavery and everyone in the North is anti-slavery. Doesn't mean Northerners were abolitionists. Understand what they're saying. They're saying, well, I don't want to strike at slavery where it exists, but it is a backwards system. It's a system from another era. Capitalism is much more dynamic and freewheeling and better. So why don't we just stop the spread of it? That's all they were saying, really. That's not even an abolitionist position. That's what's often called a free soil position. That was the position of most Northerners at the time. And the Southerners just lumped them together with abolitionists and just said, you guys are radicals and you're crazy. Let's talk about California real quick, because we are equally important. I would say much more important than Texas. We're the largest state in the Union. You guys know we're the 5th largest economy in the world. If we were our own country, we would only be behind the rest of the United States, China, Japan, and Germany. We would be next. California has a bigger economy than Canada, bigger than Germany's, bigger than France's, bigger than Britain. And we have fewer people than those countries, which is rather astonishing because we got Elon Musk, and we got, Silicon Valley, and we've got, we're the biggest farming state in the Union. People often don't think that, but we are. We've got Hollywood. We've got everything going for us, right? So we started out as the Bear Flag Republic just for a couple of weeks, and then the US government said, no, no, no. We're going to annex you, and you're going to become a territory and then a state. Now, it's very interesting. California becomes a state faster than any of these other territories we get, except for Texas. Texas had a large population, and it immediately goes to statehood. California becomes a state almost immediately after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Like, the ink was not even dry yet, February 1848. About 3-4 months later in the summer, gold is discovered at Sutter's Mill. You guys know the story because you went to school in California. You did your missions, and then you did Sutter's Mill, I'm sure, in elementary school. And of course, word spreads all around the world that gold was discovered in California. Now, what's amazing is there was no railway system linking California to the rest of the country. Basically, the eastern part of the country was the furthest point, right? Our population centers were all east of the Mississippi and really east of the Appalachians still. If you wanted to go from like New York, Boston, Baltimore, Philly to California, you had to take a train to St. Louis, Missouri, which is the gateway of the West. That's why they have that big arch there. And you would then buy a wagon, and then you would start marching. And it would probably take you about 2 months to march all the way across the US. Or you could sail from New York all the way, there's no Panama Canal yet, all the way south around Argentina up to San Francisco. That would take about 5 or 6 months. It was safer, but it took much longer to do. And so these white settlers that pour into California, they find actually who gets there first are settlers from China and from Latin America who arrive trying to find their fortune. And people just pour in to California. If you look at the statistics, it's unbelievable. San Francisco, much older city than Los Angeles, had a population of only about 1,000 in 1848. And in 2 years' time, the population explodes to 35,000 people, which was almost big enough in itself to become a state. But the areas around San Francisco absorb population as well. And California almost immediately, because of the gold rush, has huge numbers of people and can become a state. And before we talk about statehood, let's talk about how California emerges as an economy. For a couple of years, you know, the gold rush, these independent miners come in where they buy their own plot of land, they work their own plot of land. Some of them find gold, most of them don't. And so you have the miners, and then you have the secondary economy of the miners. People show up who say, oh, you're a fool if you look for gold, but I'm going to open up a shop selling mining equipment to the miners. I'm going to sell pans and pickaxes and hats and shovels and like the genius, American business genius, Levi Strauss, I'm going to sell jeans to these people. Levi Strauss came from New York to San Francisco to make his fortune. He tried for a few months. He didn't find anything. Levi Strauss was a Jewish American from New York, and he was a tailor by trade. And so he discovered that working in regular pants, you know, kneeling on rocks all day and standing in water, canvas is not a very strong material. It rips easily. Denim is much stronger. But Levi was from New York. He was sophisticated. He said, I don't want to wear overalls like I'm some hick. Why can't you make pants out of overalls, right? And so he called these waist overalls, and he would sell them in his store, basically. Well, first he wore them himself, and everybody said, hey, Levi, what you got going on there? And he told them. They said, yeah, those are cool. I like those as well. He started selling them in a little store. He made so much money that he just said, you know what? I'm just going to make a little outpost here and sell mining equipment and jeans. And the rest is history. It's a major multi-million-dollar company today, an all-American company out of San Francisco. And the rest is history, essentially. Other people discover the Central Valley, and they find out, wow, this is a Mediterranean climate, and you can eat and plant very exotic things here. Understand that most Americans only ate fruit a couple months a year. You'd pick apples in September, October, and then mom would usually try to preserve it into jams and jellies so you could have sweets the rest of the year. That was it. Most people never had exotic fruits because they traveled so far from exotic places, and there was no refrigeration or containerization back then. Most Americans had never had a grape or a banana or an avocado or anything. And now you could grow that stuff right in California. You'd have the Intercontinental Railroad in 1869, and then you could start shipping these very exotic foods to the rest of the country. Think about all the stuff we have, right? Most California thing, avocados, California style, right? California burrito, it's got avocado on it. Avocado toast, I still haven't had it, but that's what we're known for here. I had an avocado tree in my backyard growing up. I didn't think it was that out of the ordinary until my cousins from Missouri would visit every 5 years or so, and they were amazed. They're like, you have 4 orange trees, an apricot tree, and an avocado tree? Oh my gosh. I'd say, yeah, what do you guys have? Corn, That's all we got. That's all that grows in Missouri. Corn and grain, basically. So you got cornfields all over the place. So like, what I love is February to August, you can go to these little Thackerberry stands and get strawberries, grown in Southern California, real close by. And they're wonderful, the best in the world. In Missouri, you stop at roadside stands and you buy corn. Yeah, not that cool. But we can also grow all of these other wonderful things, right? Nuts like almonds and cashews and all these exotic things, grapes, apricots, oranges, cherries, lemons, limes. Some of you probably have lemon and lime trees in your front or backyard. All of this stuff, it just flourished in the Central Valley and is going to be sold, and people will make a lot of money. So notice our economy is a free market economy. One thing we cannot grow is cotton. And so no one really brings slaves into California. People come in for the gold rush or to sell to gold rush people or to be involved in the agricultural trade. And it's a free state economy, basically. So by 1849, California has the population, it petitions for statehood, and this causes an enormous political crisis because Southerners, just like in 1820, say we had no say in the slavery status in California. Mexico abolished slavery there, and now it just sort of formed itself as a state. And we don't think slavery should be banned. We think that people should be able to take their slaves to that territory, and we should have a say in it. The attitude now of Southerners was very militant. 40 years ago, prior to this, they had felt slavery is a dying system and it will die out in 40 or 50 years. Notice the 3630 line gave most of the territory in Louisiana to the North. They were comfortable in the South saying slavery would die out by 1860. Now that it's 1849, they're saying, no, it's got to grow. They had slave revolts in the 1830s. The British banned slavery. Abolitionists were much more militant. And so Southerners felt very defensive, and slavery had to grow so that it wouldn't go extinct. And so California's petition to enter the Union almost unleashed a civil war. I mean, it was that tense. Now, we had an election in 1848, and the war hero, Zachary Taylor, wins. He's another Whig, the only other Whig other than William Henry Harrison, another general who became president. And Taylor is a weird guy, meaning he was a Southerner. He was from Louisiana. He owned slaves. He had a plantation that grew both sugar and cotton. He owned hundreds of slaves. Yet, being in the Army, he had a very national view of America. He had lived most of his life outside of Louisiana. And he felt that slavery was a very divisive institution and that most of the country was outside of the South. 2/3 of the population was in the North. He knew that because he had spent time in the Army. And he felt that even though as a person, he was tied to slavery, that it was better for the country to probably get rid of this horrible institution. Very weird. And so Taylor basically said, okay, I think California should come in as a state right now, no slavery, and New Mexico as well. New Mexico had a larger population than California. The reason why most people didn't want New Mexico to become a state, number one, slavery didn't exist there. Number two, it was full of Mexicans. And a lot of people just said, we can't have mestizo, Catholic, Spanish-speaking people own their own state because then we can't boss them around anymore. If they're a territory, we can tell them what to do. Once they become a state, we have to respect their rights, and we don't want to do that. Notice that New Mexico is one of the last states to enter the Union. It's number 47. It's not a state until 1912. That was because they waited until whites were the majority population, and then it became a state. The Whigs wanted it to become a state right then. That would be 2 new free states, 2 more senators from California, 2 more from New Mexico. South Carolina said, no way, ain't going to happen. We're going to secede and create a civil war over this. And so, amazingly, Taylor said, I'm calling your bluff. I don't think you got the guts to do it. And Calhoun was ready. He had been practicing this for basically 30 years, since 1820. Practiced it again over the tariff and the nullification crisis in 1833. And Calhoun was not backing down. It looked like this law, if it did pass, admitting these 2 states as free, probably we would have had a civil war in 1849 or 1850. It does not pass. Henry Clay once again saved the Union. He said, look, I'm a slave owner, so I understand the South, but I'm also a businessman and a banker, so I understand the North. I can understand both sides. Here is what we will do. He had a, excuse me, a political partner, senator from Illinois by the name of Stephen Douglas, who helped him shepherd this compromise through the Congress. And so the Union was saved in a grand compromise called the Compromise of 1850. Number one, California was indeed admitted to the Union as a free state. There was no way getting around that, basically. That you couldn't force slavery on that system. It wouldn't exist there, right? Um, Daniel Webster, very interestingly at this point, said, this is a very weird argument to have. We're arguing over an imaginary slave in an impossible place. What he meant was, we don't have to ban slavery in California. God has banned it in California, meaning slavery can't exist there because cotton can't grow. It's too dry. It can't grow in Arizona. Why are we even having this debate? It'd be absurd. What Webster did not know was that slaves didn't just grow cotton. Slaves worked in mines. Slaves worked on ranches. Worked in factories in Kentucky and Missouri. There's nothing written down in the law that says slaves can only grow cotton. So Southerners felt that maybe they could extend it there. But at the end of the day, they backed off on that because they got something else in return. Excuse me. They got a much stronger, vigorous Fugitive Slave Act. Now, there was technically a Fugitive Slave Act before this. It's part of the reason our Constitution was written, was to catch runaway slaves who left the South and moved to the North. Now, this was accelerating in the 1840s. People like Harriet Tubman, people like John Brown were running these escape missions, having slaves escape from the South and whisking them away to the North or to Canada, where they couldn't be extradited. And we did have a 1793 fugitive slave law, but all of the resources were to the North, meaning that if you were a slave owner looking for a runaway slave, you had to pay for the tracking down of that slave. You had to pay the court fees because you had to decide, is this really a runaway? And they deserved their day in court. And it was almost impossible. If your slave escaped and ran away to Boston, it was damn near impossible by 1850 to get him back. What a lot of these northern states did was they passed these so-called personal liberty laws, which is basically nullification. It was, okay, if you're claiming this as a runaway, then the state of Massachusetts is going to pay for their legal fees. We're going to drag this out. You're going to have a state hearing before you have your federal hearing. And it effectively made that Fugitive Slave Act, that federal law, null and void. You get a new one in 1850 that turned the tables and wiped out those personal liberty laws. Now, all you had to do was file a $10 fee in court, which was a lot of money back then, but we're talking about probably $200 today, not much to a slave owner. And now the federal government would spend vast resources. Federal marshals would go into the North, track down runaway slaves. They would not get a federal trial. You would be presumed guilty if you had black skin. In fact, when this law was passed, thousands of free blacks in the North immigrate to Canada because posters went up everywhere saying, free black and free black men and free black women of the North, beware, slave catchers are everywhere. Some stayed and they joined Abolitionist Society and traveled in pairs. Others immigrated. And this law was a terrible law. In its worst iteration, there was a woman who escaped slavery in the 1830s as a young girl, grew up in the North, gave birth to 5 children, all born in northern free areas. And under this new Fugitive Slave Act, she was tracked down, brought back to slavery, and her 5 children were brought to slavery too, and they had all been born free. That's how wicked and awful, pernicious this law was. So that is sort of a bone thrown to the South. California comes in as a free state. Third, DC. This had always been a troublesome issue. DC is a federal territory. It's not a state. So the status of slavery needs to be set by the Congress. Okay. Notice that the states decide the status of slavery themselves. The only area that we're really arguing on a national level is the Congress, because Congress controls the territories, but they also control DC. DC was southern in its geography, and slavery had existed there forever. And this really bothered especially Yankees from Connecticut and Massachusetts who had to go serve in the Congress, and they saw not only slavery, but slave auctions, slave jails on their way to work. There was one just 2 blocks from the Capitol where human beings would be sold at auction. This was hugely embarrassing to the US. Think about it, all of our embassies are in DC. So the British and the Dutch and the French, they would hear us, toot our own horn about how we're a free democratic republic, we're the best country in the world. And the British would say, really? I just walked past a slave auction today where a woman was being sold away from her children, and literally children torn out of mother's arms and tears. Is that free? Is that wonderful? And so Northerners said, if we're not going to end slavery itself in DC, can we at least end this filthy, awful trade in human beings, the slave trade? Southerners said, all right, we'll give you that. Slavery itself would exist, plantations. You could have, house servants as slaves in DC, but you could no longer buy or sell a slave in the District of Columbia. You had to go outside of the city to Virginia or Maryland to buy or sell a slave, and they thought that was a small sacrifice. That's fine. Finally, and most importantly, what do we do with the rest of the territories? Texas would be the slave state, California would be the free state. What about the rest of these territories? What about Utah? What about Arizona? What about New Mexico? What about Colorado? What would all these states be? Nobody knew. So what really happened in the last 30 years was polarization. In 1820, you got enough people to draw a line and say, freedom on the top, slavery on the bottom. They tried to draw that line there. They said, why don't we just extend the 3630 line? It cuts the rest of those territories in half. Northern side free, southern side slave. Northerners felt, nope, that gives too much to the South, no more slave states. Northerners are basically free soilers by this time. The Southerners said, no, that gives too much to the North. We need to counteract all the area we gave away to Louisiana, north of 3630. So no, that gives too much to the other side. So they couldn't get any agreement on 3630. Another way that you might do it is to basically let the territories decide for themselves, essentially. And that's basically what they did. There was this new idea that came out known as popular sovereignty, where you would let the citizens of the territory decide that issue for themselves. So if people moved to Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, when that population was big enough to become a state, they would vote on the issue. Now, this illustrates a number of things. Number one, what it illustrates is we just could not come to an agreement. We just couldn't. This is very much a sign of a failure of leadership. And you guys, I think, know this. Because if you ask mom, hey, can I have the keys to the car? I want to go out with my friends. And what if they don't want to fight with you, but they don't really want you to go? What do they say? Ask your father, right? I know that trick because I got a kid. And when I want to be the good guy, Daddy, can I have an extra dessert? Can I have more candy? Why don't you ask your mother? That way I'm still the good guy. If she says no, I'm like, oh, well, it wasn't me that said no. That's what the federal government's doing here. We can't decide the issue. Let those people decide it over there. So it was a failure of leadership. Second, what we would see happen, what people didn't quite realize but happened very quickly, is that this policy is eventually adopted. And it was a disaster because it basically creates a giant magnet for the most insane people to move to that territory and live side by side with each other. The most intense abolitionists that are straight up murdering people over slavery, like John Brown did, will move out there, and they're going to live side by side with slave owners who love slavery. This is going to be a recipe for success, right? Not so much. But at the time, it did save the day. Now, this compromise, this is the summer of 1850, it was going to be vetoed. As it was cobbled together by Clay, it passed the House, it passed the Senate, and Taylor said, I'm going to veto this because it gives too much to the South and I want to wipe out slavery. I think California should come free. New Mexico should come in as free, no popular sovereignty, total ban on slavery, the Wilmot Proviso, right? We're going to ban slavery in the rest of these territories. No Fugitive Slave Act. So amazingly, this is a slave owner who was an anti-slavery president, and God overruled this. Just as Taylor was about to veto this, he died. He was celebrating the 4th of July, and he had a huge feast, and after the feast, he got a stomach infection. He got gastroenteritis, and he died a couple of weeks later. The new president, Millard Fillmore from the North, weirdly enough, was much more open to slavery. He didn't like slavery in the North, but he said, I'll negotiate with Southerners on this. Signs the Compromise of 1850, and there were huge celebrations all over the country. But really what had happened is this was a 10-year truce. Probably good because the country got stronger, the North got, stronger to win this conflict. Abraham Lincoln would be president rather than Millard Fillmore. I don't think he could really win this war. But really it was a truce. At the time it was celebrated as, the Union is preserved, the Constitution, the Revolution, we're going to still be one country. 10 years later, the Civil War would happen, and it would happen over slavery in the territories out west. So congratulations, California. You almost broke up the Union, just like Yoko Ono. Good for you. That's an old Beatles joke. I don't know if you guys get that or not. But anyway, we are done. with this lecture. So make sure you answer the questions and turn those in. And I'll see you next time. Bye, guys.